Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Stuart and Mark and the Pitt Street team for the invitation. And of course, to the Baker McKenzie team for hosting us today. Great opportunity to introduce our company or reintroduce it to those that have been following the story for a while. And this is an incredibly exciting time for us. We've got a major data readout coming up in the next few months. So very, very timely to have this discussion. So let me just jump straight in and talk a little bit about what we do. And I'm going to start here and just show you an overview of the company's pipeline. And this is both accurate and deceptive in a sense, because we are, for our size, we're about a $100 million company. We are, for our size, a surprisingly diversified business. We have 2 assets in our pipeline, both clinical stage, and certainly our lead asset, Avicursen, ATL1102, which you see in sort of the top 3/4 of the slide there, is a drug with a huge amount of potential in a very, very broad range of inflammatory diseases. You sometimes hear pharmaceutical companies talk about a drug as a pipeline and a molecule, and it's become almost a little bit of a cliche in our industry. But if any drug deserved that epithet, it would be Avicursen, our drug. So we have really a lot of breadth in the company. However, we've made a very, very conscious decision over the last 18 to 24 months to focus in on trying to do one thing well. We take a view that sometimes small companies try and spread themselves too thin. They try and do an awful lot of things at once. We think we need to walk before we can run, and we want to try and crack one particular nut and really kind of show what we can do. And that particular thing that we're trying to do is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which you can see is the top part of Avicursen there. It's the top arrow. Our drug is in a trial in that disease, a phase 2b clinical trial. It's a late stage clinical trial. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning, because that's very much the focus of our business right at the moment. So let me talk a little bit about Duchenne, first of all, just to try and give you a flavor of what we're trying to solve for here. And I hope not too many people in the room are familiar with Duchenne, because it really is one of the most horrifying diseases in modern medicine. This is a genetic disease of children. Kids are born with it, and it's one of the more common genetic diseases of children. About 1 in 6,000 boys are born with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's been a couple of mentions already today of Neuron Pharmaceuticals, a company that in some ways is very, very loosely analogous to what we're trying to do. They, of course, developed a drug for a disease called Rett syndrome, another genetic disease of children. Duchenne is about 2.5 times more common than Rett syndrome. So it gives you some sort of benchmark for the prevalence of this disease. Kids born with Duchenne, and by the way, because of the genetics of this disease, it is almost exclusively boys that are born with the disease. So boys born with Duchenne lack a protein in their muscles called dystrophin. And dystrophin is a structural protein. And without dystrophin, what happens is that every time you move a limb, the muscle causes mechanical damage. I sometimes use the analogy that it's a little bit like running your car without any oil in the engine. All the pistons and the cranks and the gears grate against each other, and the engine just tears itself apart. Something kind of like that is what happens in the muscles of a boy with Duchenne. So it starts to manifest at the age of about 4 or 5, and these kids get progressive muscle weakness. They're usually wheelchair bound by the time they hit their teens, and life expectancy is in the mid-20s. So this is an absolutely devastating disease, as you can imagine, for families that are touched by it. What have we got in the way of treatments? Well, we do have some therapeutic options here, but the trouble is, to cut a long story short, they don't work real well. There's 2 real schools of thought in Duchenne. And so in the top half of the slide here, I've shown a group of what I would describe as dystrophin replacement therapies. Sort of stands to reason that if the problem here is a lack of dystrophin in your muscles, you want to try and come up with drugs that are going to replace dystrophin. And we do have about 6 drugs that try and do that. Here's the problem. Most of those drugs are very, very specific to particular subsets of the disease. Typically, they apply to kind of 8 to 12% of kids with Duchenne. Second, they just don't work really well. Pretty much every one of these drugs has consistently failed to meet its primary endpoint in every major clinical trial that's ever been conducted. They don't produce a lot of dystrophin, and the dystrophin they produce is not as good as the real thing. So although we have some options here, they really don't move the needle very much for these kids. So on the lower half of the slide, we have a group of anti-inflammatory therapies, because what happens in Duchenne is if you have this missing protein dystrophin, you're causing all this constant damage in your muscles. It sets up chronic inflammation, a bit like chronic hepatitis or asthma or multiple sclerosis. It's a chronic inflammatory disease at its heart. And so we treat this disease with anti-inflammatory therapies. And for 30 or 40 years now, we've used steroids predominantly for this purpose. Steroids, of course, are our go-to anti-inflammatory drug for just about any inflammatory disease. And we use them in Duchenne as well. And look, they work a bit, but they really don't work great. They just slow the disease down a little bit. And steroids are pretty toxic drugs, especially for kids going through puberty. These are not great drugs to be on for any length of time. So there is an enormous need for anti-inflammatory therapies which can slow the progress of the disease, but which are not steroids in mechanism. And that's where our drug comes in. That's where avacursen fits into the treatment landscape here. This is an anti-inflammatory drug, but it's not a steroid. It actually works by slowing white blood cells getting into the tissues. And that's a big part of the inflammatory process. So if we stop the white blood cells getting into the tissues, into the muscles, that damps down the inflammation. That slows the deterioration of muscle function in these kids. So that's what we're trying to do. And as with all biotech companies, we've tested this out in mouse models and in the lab. And look, long story short, it seems to do exactly what we're hoping it would do. So you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, we do see a reduction in white blood cells getting into muscle tissue, and that's exactly what we're hoping to see. And in the middle part of the slide, you can see that that seems to result in an improvement in muscle function in a mouse model of this disease. So far, so good. The drug's doing exactly what we would hope. So a couple of years ago, we did a pilot study, what we call a phase 2A study at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. And this study was conducted in 9 boys with Duchenne. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge number, but in diseases like Duchenne, that's actually a pretty good sized trial. And we actually specifically did the study in boys who are what we call nonambulant. I mentioned that kids, once they hit their teens, are usually wheelchair bound for the rest of their lives. That has the effect of dividing the Duchenne population roughly 50-50 into an early stage ambulant population, kids who can still walk in effect, and a later stage non-ambulant population, kids who are wheelchair bound. We've been looking so far at the non-ambulant population, the roughly 50% of kids who are no longer able to walk. And the reason we've done that is just because out of all the existing therapies, poor as they are, most of them are really just for ambulant kids. So the non-ambulant population, this later stage population, is really poorly served by our existing treatment options. So we've gone in at the end, which needs new therapies most. To be clear, we fully expect our drug could work in the ambulant population, but look, as a small company, you have to choose your battles. If we were Pfizer, we'd probably be doing 3 or 4 studies at once to look at these things, but we have to kind of pick our sequence for these things, and so we've gone in for the non-ambulant population. So I'm going to pick out one data point on here, which is the top line in that kind of main table there, and that describes a test called PUL2. Stands for performance in the upper limb. And because these kids are wheelchair bound, we can't look at things like walk tests or stair climbing, or some of the common measures we use in these kind of diseases. We have to look at arm function. And PUL2 is a composite measure of wrist, elbow, and shoulder function. It really translates into things like, can the boy drink a cup of water? Can he brush his teeth? Can he operate a joystick on a wheelchair? Those sorts of things. So really reflects, in effect, the quality of life of a kid with this disease. And what we saw in our study is that after 6 months on our drug, after 6 months on avacursen, the boys in the study showed an average improvement of 0.9 points on this PUL2 score. Now you might say, well, is that good? What happens if they don't have the drug? Well, this was a single-arm study, as is usually the case in these kind of pilot studies. We have to try and answer that question by looking at what we call historical controls, looking at what happens to kids outside the study. But we found a great data set out of Rome, Italy, and we picked out what we call a matched historical controls. That is, kids that exactly resemble the ones in our study. And in that group, which actually contained 36 kids, we saw over the same period of time, over 6 months, a deterioration of 2 points on this PUL2 score. And we've triangulated this by looking at control groups of other clinical trials, looking at natural history cohorts, and it rings true. This feels like about the right number. So what this implies is that there's a difference of about 2.9 points on the PUL2 score over 6 months associated with our drug. Now, we've kind of tested that out by going to clinicians and saying to them, well, look, if we came to you with a drug that had this kind of impact on the disease, what would you make of that? And universally, the feedback has been, well, that would be the best thing that has ever been seen for non-ambulant kids with Duchenne. No drug has shown that level of efficacy. That would be an extremely useful addition to the therapeutic armamentarium, and that would be an extremely viable commercial product. So we think this is really encouraging data. However, it's a smaller study, 9 patients, and it's a single-arm study. So we need to see this replicated in a larger randomized controlled study. So that's what we're doing. Back in June of last year, we started a phase 2b study, which really builds on the success of that earlier phase 2a study, but is looking to provide really, really solid, credible data that we can show to regulatory agencies. And I won't go through all the gory detail here, but suffice to say we're doing this in broadly the same population, so non-ambulant boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We're actually giving 2 doses of our drug. The lower dose is the one we tried in the earlier study. We're also giving a higher dose just to see if we can push the efficacy up a bit more. There is a placebo group, so we've got a comparison in the study. This is the gold standard evidence for regulatory agencies like FDA. And we measure the effect of the drug after 6 months, and then we actually measure it again after 12 months. So we actually get multiple bites of the cherry here, multiple shots on goal. We'll be getting our 6-month data in December. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is an exciting time for us. As you can imagine, all eyes within Percheron now are on this December readout. This is potentially one of the most impactful data readouts in the history of our company. So we will see that first 6-month data readout within about the next 3 months or so. Where could that take us? Where do we go with this data in hand? Well, broadly speaking, there's 3 kind of possibilities here. If the data is great, if it's shooting the lights out, and by shooting the lights out, I mean if it looks a bit like the comparison I just outlined for our phase 2a study, 2.9 points of difference on the PUL2 score. If it's looking that good, we think there is a very realistic possibility that this could position us for what FDA calls accelerated approval. As I'm sure everybody knows, traditionally there's 3 phases of clinical development for a new drug, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But in diseases like Duchenne, where the prognosis of the disease is terrible, where the disease is rare, where it's poorly served by existing treatments, FDA will often make drugs available with less than that full body of data. And this process is called accelerated approval. Just about every drug that's been approved in Duchenne over the last decade has received accelerated approval. In this disease space, it's the rule, not the exception. So we think there's a possibility here for that. We're not really going to know what our chances are until we see the data, until we get the chance to go and talk to FDA about it, but it's absolutely non-zero. More conservatively, and to be transparent, this is our base case, the data is directionally looking positive, but we need to do some additional work to convince regulatory agencies. And that could be as little as adding an extra 15, 20 patients. It could be a full phase 3 study, although in that scenario, we think that would likely be done in conjunction with a partner. So that's a perfectly good outcome. We'd be very happy with that. But again, we have to see the data to judge that. And look, as I always say to investors, this is biotech, right? So things can go unexpectedly. In the in the case where we get a rude surprise out of our trial, one of the great things about our drug is it has proven activity in a whole range of other inflammatory diseases. So there are other places that we could turn avocarsin to. This isn't a one-trick pony. This isn't an all-or-nothing gamble on one clinical trial. We do have other use cases for the drug, other opportunities to provide benefits to patients. So just say a couple more things, just a word on kind of the economics here. Duchenne is an example of what is known in the pharmaceutical industry as an orphan disease, sometimes referred to as a rare disease. And one of the reasons this is an attractive space for drug development companies is that the economics here is incredibly attractive. I always feel a little bit cynical talking about these sort of things in the context of a disease as terrible as Duchenne, but of course it is part of the reality for us as a company and for you as investors. And part of what is attractive here is that the pricing for drugs in diseases like this is fantastic. So many of those approved therapies I spoke about are $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 per year of treatment. One of the most recently approved therapies, Elevidys, the first gene therapy approved in this disease, retails for $3.2 million a shot. It's one of the most expensive drugs in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. So suffice to say, if we are able to deliver a commercial product here, the economics for us as a business is extremely attractive. Now, I say that as if we would be the company that would take this drug to market, but we've been very transparent that our strategy for avocarsin is to seek a partnership for the drug. And again, we've seen references today already to Neuron and to their partnership with Acadia. There's an awful lot of ways that partnerships can look, but certainly our ambition is to put the drug into the hands of one or more larger companies who can really do it justice, who share our passion for the disease and for the medicine, but which have the capabilities and the infrastructure and the resources to really get this to patients as quickly and effectively as possible. I put up here a list of some very, very broadly comparable rare disease transactions. Every disease is unique, okay? So individual mileage will vary. But this gives us some sort of benchmark for what these diseases can look like. And I think it's fair to say that within the broader pharmaceutical industry, there is an enormous appetite for assets and for companies that are working in these rare disease spaces. Big pharma companies that don't already have a footprint here are generally keen to develop one because, as I say, this is an extremely favorable space in economic terms. So we think there's an opportunity to build real value here in our company, particularly off the back of positive data in this ongoing clinical trial. So I'm going to pretty much stop there. I'm just going to say maybe one or two more things, just a very quick flavor of the company. As Stuart mentioned up front, our company was previously known as Antisense Therapeutics. We've been through a little bit of a metamorphosis over the last year or two. I came on board as CEO about a year ago, and we have almost completely renewed the team and the board over the last couple of years. We are a lean organization, but one with enormous experience in international drug development, gleaned mostly in large pharmaceutical companies. So I'm very proud of the team I represent today. I'm really delighted to be able to share the story with you and really happy to open for questions.